And Amy, USA Today op-ed from friend of the show, Joe Trippi, talking about the Doug Jones victory in Alabama for the U.S. Senate race there. Trippi suggests that Democrats can scale that victory in Alabama nationally. He's got a few items he suggests must be done in order to capitalize on the enthusiasm that Democrats have, mostly fueled by their antipathy towards Trump, of course. Run everywhere and anywhere. We need similar people to step up, like Doug Jones, step up and run for office throughout the South, such as Senate candidate Phil Breedston, the former Tennessee governor, but also in the Midwest and other supposedly Trump or Republican strongholds. It kind of sounds like me talking about Illinois or in Chicago specifically. Don't trim your sails. Jones is a moderate Democrat willing to work across the aisle. Well, he may be moderate to Joe Trippi, but he's not a moderate Democrat. But anyway, the point is to say he didn't alter his support he didn't alter pro-choice, he didn't alter his position on immigration, marriage redefinition, et cetera, to curry favor with constituencies in Alabama. Okay, it's interesting. He suggests that the Democrats have an energized coalition that can produce electoral magic. College-educated white suburbanites, which we talked about yesterday, college-educated women, a 32-point deficit, Republicans to Democrats with respect to the question of who should control Congress, and millennials of all races and ethnicities help produce the Jones victory margin as well. Trippi does strike one note of caution. The special election stood alone on the political calendar with everyone focused on one campaign. That obviously won't be the case in November. There's one other big note of caution that Joe, I love him, but that he fails to mention. All of the Republican candidates running around the country that are protecting their seats in the House in particular, and the Democrats in red states that are targeted for replacement, places like Indiana and South Dakota and West Virginia, they don't get to run against Roy Moore.
No, they don't.
that is one big note of caution that Joe Trippi doesn't include. So I take some of his suggestions as legitimate, generally speaking, but the idea that the Alabama example is something that can be replicated around the country,
not going to happen.
I think is a little wistful. But for more on this topic, and then, of course, we'll get back to talking about Michael Wolff's bombshell. That shook Washington and Bannon and
reading.
Trump. And yeah, I know.
Now about his McDonald's.
We all can't help but be titillated by the back and forth between political characters. More on both of these topics. We're pleased to be joined by Noah Rothman, Associate Editor for Commentary Magazine, commentary.com. Noah, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with Trippi, though, before we get to sharing our favorite excerpts from Michael Wolff's book. His suggestion about the landscape heading into 18 and what, if anything, Democrats can legitimately draw from Doug Jones's victory in Alabama.
Excuse me. I take some exceptions with some quibbles, I suppose, with some elements of Mr. Trippi's op-ed. You noted the obvious, which is that Roy Moore is not a duplicable phenomenon across the country necessarily. Pardon. There will definitely be opportunities for Republicans to nominate unelectable candidates, for example, and Democrats most likely will experience the very same thing because they have an energized activist base, and the energized activist base commands the primaries. Republicans know very well how that turns out. Lost a couple of winnable Senate seats in 2010 and 2012, and even 2014 as a result of nominating unelectable candidates. The notion, however, that Mr. Jones demonstrated his capacity to work across the aisle is an invention of Joe Trippi's imagination. He didn't suggest that he would be very much of a bipartisan senator, and this morning he's appeared on MSNBC where he struggled to identify an area in which he would work across the aisle. He's pretty much a placeholder in that seat. Also, the notion that you should not appeal, or rather trim your sails, quote-unquote, to appeal to broader demographics. It's one thing to be principled, and I suppose Mr. Jones is a principled individual. I have no reason to doubt otherwise. But it's another to be rigid and inflexible to the point where you're self-sabotaging in a campaign. That's just dumb politics. If you're going to run for a district, you should fit the district. And all the evidence we have suggests that Doug Jones's position on abortion was a hindrance, was a drag on the ticket. He might have scored a much larger victory than he managed had he been able to appeal to the sensibilities of his state on that issue. And also, Trippy sort of equates Doug Jones's a capacity as a prosecutor in combating the KKK with his principled objection to limits on abortion, as though these two things were equatable, and they're not, and it's extremely offensive to say otherwise. That being said, I think he's right on the money. I think the wave is sort of inevitable. It's been evident in special elections, in the off-year elections. We have now a mountain of evidence that suggests Republicans are depressed and Democrats are energized, and Republicans are not turning out and Democrats are, and that will lead to a wave Democratic victory in 2018.
Well, moving on to the news that the big book bombshell from Michael Wolff, Fire and Fury. I'm sure you've read some of the excerpts. What is your favorite part so far?
Gosh, what is my favorite part?
Yes.
Well, if you have a chance to peruse the Hollywood Insider, I think is where it was published today, piece by Michael Wolff, not just the excerpts in The Guardian that we saw yesterday, but also, his op-ed, which includes quite a bit of those excerpts from the book and a little bit more of his voice in THR, Hollywood Reporter, is the extent to which the initial administration, the early administration before John Kelly came in, was such a hapless, chaotic environment in which individuals were engaged in this sort of melee to appease and appeal to the president themselves and ingratiate themselves to the president, and ended up doing his administration harm as a result. And I don't think you can blame them for trying to appeal to their boss. It is the boss who sets the tone and who sets the managerial style, and that's clearly Trump's managerial style. There are a lot of people who think this book is just all full of falsehoods, and it is true that this author has a particular habit of equating, or rather not making very clear, what is inference and what is, I guess, his take on the atmosphere with actual quotes that are demonstrable in events that occurred. So it is kind of hard to make those distinctions. But at the same time, a lot of the things that he's talking about, we all lived through, and it's not like these are new revelations. The details of them, the explicit quotes are new, but the events that he describes, the atmosphere that he describes, the kind of chaos that we all lived through, it was in the headlines. We all remember it. So there's going to be a lot of calls that this is all fake news. But I think a lot of it rings very true to me.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that it rings true, at least in terms of perspectives, a belief that Bannon said the things he said. Otherwise, Trump doesn't issue the 200-word, 265-word response that doesn't say Steve Bannon would never say those things. It goes right for Steve Bannon's jugular.
Yeah, right. That was my first impression, too, was that the White House's first response, which was apparently dictated by Donald Trump in that missive directed at Steve Bannon, wasn't to say this is all nonsense. It was, this guy's a lunatic, and you shouldn't believe him. He's off the rails, So that, is kind of a tell, to me at least.
But is this?
I'm not sure whether. I'm sorry. Continue.
But is this a happy event? Maybe not a desired, but does this turn out to be a useful event for Trump, separating himself from Bannon?
Well, I mean, it could be. It's not as though he didn't separate himself from Bannon when he was let go from the administration. They had every opportunity to do so. I have a piece in the New York Daily News today talking about how Steve Bannon immediately went to work on the outside, quote-unquote, helping Donald Trump to achieve what he thinks are Donald Trump's objectives, which are really his own. And in the process of helping, undermining Republicans who he needs for legislative victories, undermining a winnable candidate in Alabama, and doing his best to rid Donald Trump of the family that he's surrounded himself with. He's managed to alienate everybody, including and especially the president. So Steve Bannon is a rather comic, tragic figure in this whole thing. But again, it's Donald Trump's administration. He staffed this thing. He, in the transition, created the conditions where they had Steve Bannon, Reince Priebus, and Mike Flynn, and everybody else who was a burden on this administration at the very highest levels. of the administration, and it's only managed to find its legs now that he's sort of outsourced the job of government to people who know how government works. So, if to the extent that this administration is sort of righting the ship, Mike Wolf's book is a retrospective on the time in which it was taking on water. And I think everybody should really take it as that sense. There's a lot of defensiveness about this book, as though it depicts something that's horrible, and it demonstrates that this administration is incompetent. And to an extent it does, but to another extent, it shows how the administration has evolved in a positive way over the course of the last 6 months.
Yeah.
Well, but Steve Bannon, I mean, he used to downplay the Russian investigation all the time, and then here he's saying, I would have called the FBI, and this is treasonous that they had that meeting at Trump Tower between Don Jr., Kushner, and Manafort, and that Russian lawyer.
Yeah, and this is, it's not treasonous, but by definition. But it is stupid, and it may yet have broader implications for the Mueller investigation, and we don't know that. But what we do know is that Steve Bannon hates Jared Kushner, and Steve Bannon is not a fan of Don Jr. or Ivanka, and he wants to create fissures between Donald Trump and his children. And Steve Bannon was always going to be on the losing end of that thing. And that's the where you can see he's trying to manipulate events in a very, sort of haphazard, ill-considered way. And that's how he's always operated. It's why he's on the outside now.
Although it is interesting, I agree with your perspective on it. It's kind of a retrospective, the early days and chaos, and now the evolution and the maturation of the administration. But frankly, it's you read at least some of these experts, and you think about those early days, and you think about some of these characters. It's sort of amazing they were able to put together as much talent as they ultimately did put together, at least at like the cabinet level. I know there's a lot of vacancies at subordinate levels in some of these agencies, but you had conservative pundit after conservative pundit, myself included, remarking very favorably about the team that Trump put together with respect to his cabinet specifically, and then of course one of his first decisions out of the gate, the selection of Neil Gorsuch.
Yeah, there are a lot of members of this administration I think are perfectly competent and capable of administering their departments and delivering conservative victories. I'm especially fond of people like Betsy DeVos at Education and Scott Pruitt at EPA. And there are others who I think obviously don't match the moment, not just people like Mike Flynn, who we were very fortunate to only have in his position for 2 months, but also Reince Priebus, who is a very inadequate chief of staff. And there are people who I don't believe are especially up to their position that they currently hold. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, Robert Lighthizer at Trade, Wilbur Ross at Commerce. These are people who I don't believe are competent or capable and have an ideological objective, anti-free trade ideological objective to which I'm predisposed to oppose, but that's just me. So we can have differences of opinion on that sort of thing. But by and large, the administration is defensible. It is the president who manages this administration, who creates the environment that results in this kind of chaos. So in that sense, and I still think it's true, that the president is the weakest link of his administration.
He is Noah Rothman, Associate Editor for Commentary Magazine. Noah, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The more you listen, the more you'll know. This is Chicago's Morning Answer. On AM 560, The Answer.